Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and a good morning to all our guests joining from India and the UK. I'm Sandeepa Sahai, Coordinator in Education Insight Team South Asia region. And on behalf of British Council, I warmly welcome all the participants to this webinar. We are truly delighted with your presence. Today's event is not only exciting for what we are going to share and discuss, but also because we are rolling out our higher education dialogue series, which are planned from now until end of March 2022. More details are available on our International Education Services website. In today's webinar, we will be launching our research report on impact of financial resources on higher education choices in India, a seminal piece of work which we believe will be of value and benefit to all present here. And I'm extremely delighted that we are joined by Barbara Wickham, our country director, who will release the report. Let me take you quickly through how this session is planned today. After the official launch, we will have a presentation on the report and its findings by John McNamara, a Global Research Manager, Education Insight Team, British Council, who is also the author of the report. And immediately after, we will have a panel round in which we would examine insights from this report in discussion with our three distinguished and eminent Indian scholars and academicians, Professor Varghese, Vice Chancellor, National Institute of Educational Planning, Professor Limbadri, Telangana State Higher Education Council, and Professor Karmalkar, Vice Chancellor, University of Pune. The panel round will be moderated by Ritika Chanda Parukh, our Director Education, British Council India, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome them all. The webinar will be for an hour and 15 minutes. We will be recording it, and shortly after this event, we will be sharing the recording presentation as well as the link access for the report with all of you. In case you wish to communicate with us during the event and have questions or comments, you can use the chat box on the right side of your screen. We will make sure we pick these up and respond. I thank you once again for joining us, and I now welcome Barbara, our country director, to kindly launch the report and give her opening remarks. Thank you. Barbara, please.
You're on mute, Barbara.
Can you hear me now? Perfect.
Yes.
I don't know how many times we've done all of these team meetings and it's still you're on mute. So let me add my warm welcome to those of Sandeepa. Good afternoon, good morning, and maybe good evening to some of you joining us. It's really lovely to have you with us, and I'm really delighted, as Sandeepa said, to welcome you all to the first in our series of higher education dialogues. The dialogues are designed to connect higher education stakeholders, sector specialists, by encouraging a conversation between and across governments, businesses and higher education institutions on a range of themes, be that TNE, online and distance learning, research and innovation, and of course the National Education Policy, the NEP. We really want this series to provide an opportunity to debate, discuss, challenge and explore these themes. So do join us for the rest of the series. As Sandeepa was saying, they'll take place each month until March next year. So to jump in, India is planning, as many of you know, to expand its higher education sector to add, numbers in India are always amazingly high, but to add 80 million more places by 2030, that is just a staggering number. And this ambition will help the country achieve its target of 50% university enrolment by 2035. And the NEP suggests a range of initiatives to meet this ambition. and those initiatives include internationalisation, credit-based courses, the introduction of a 4-year multidisciplinary undergraduate programme with a range of exit options, a 4-year degree programme, online delivery, dual degree and twinning programmes with foreign universities and research institutions. And, you know, all of this is really very exciting and quite groundbreaking. And we're seeing movement on some of these already, such as the internationalisation guidelines that are being published, the Academic Bank of Credit that has started up, and a 4-year programme that may start later this year. The British Council's role is as a partner to strengthen higher education systems, be that through research, through innovation, student mobility. Between our two countries, we know is a real key ask of both of our governments. And I'm delighted today to officially launch and share our report on a topic which I'm sure is going to be of great interest to those of you in the sector. Affordability, as we know, is really important for driving student access to and choices in a higher education. And our study examines exactly that. So working with a research agency and using a combination of desk research and an online survey, we looked at the impact of financial resources on student choice and access to higher education across the length and breadth of the country. The research, we believe, will provide Indian higher education authorities, private providers and overseas universities with a broader and a better understanding of this area. Some of the findings, not to steal too much of John's thunder, are really encouraging. So like the fact, for example, that access to higher education is occurring at a relatively low level of household income in India, and other findings which are quite surprising. For example, the significant number of students from low-income households who study at private for-profit institutions. So the report will, we believe, help start an important conversation and lays the foundation for further research and analysis. It's also an example of how together we can further build on the strong partnerships in higher education between India and the UK. So without further ado, I'm delighted to launch and release the report today. So thank you very much again for coming. Of course, a copy is on our website and that'll be posted in the chat. And I'd now like to invite John, Global Head of Research, International Education Services, the author of the report, to present its interesting findings. Thank you once again for joining, and over to you, John.
I'm also muted. Thank you very much, Barbara. That's a brilliant introduction to the study. I'm just going to share my screen. I have a PowerPoint deck prepared, and let's just get this loaded from the beginning. Should be up. Okay, very good. Okay, so yes, as Barbara has outlined, this is a pretty novel study in that it's looking at the impact of financial resources on higher education choices in India. It's an area, I mean, we do quite a bit of research on India, and it's an area we feel that there's a gap in the knowledge in this area. So we're seeking to address that and to begin maybe a process. It could take some time, but this is a survey that we conducted earlier in the year. It's a very comprehensive survey. It covers all of the 6 main regions of India, 95 cities, 23 states, union territories represented. That said, there are some gaps. We didn't get as bigger responses we hoped in the Northeast. So we just got responses from 3 of the 8 states in the Northeast, and we're missing a couple of states in the North. But otherwise, the coverage here is pretty good, and it's a pretty comprehensive survey. Just briefly on the profile of the survey responses, broad even split between male and female. About 3/4 of the respondents studying at undergraduate level, and as you'd expect, quite a young age group here. 92% of students in the 18 to 25 age group. Now, the 3 broad categories of institutions that we looked at are public, private for profit, and private non-profit. These can be colleges or universities. Now, you could obviously drill down into any of those categories, but for kind of obvious reasons, we had to keep that. We had to look at a relatively high level of the institutions in India. We also, about 54% of the respondents we calculated as being in the higher socio-economic class, SEC-A, and 15% coming from the lower class, the lower socio-economic class, SEC-C. So that's just to give you a little bit of profile information before we go into the findings. One thing I want to talk a little bit about, because I'll talk about it throughout the presentation, is the our estimation of the socio-economic class of the respondents. Now, gathering household income data, we know from experience, is quite difficult. And so we decided to come at this from 2 ways. One, to ask for the household income from the students, but also to devise a question that allowed us to estimate the socio-economic background, if you like, of the students. And there's 2 questions we use, and this is the typical way you would go about this in India. We asked 2 questions. One was about ownership of 11 different consumer items in the household, and they're listed there. And the second question was about the educational, the highest level of education attainment of the head of the household. And on the basis of the response to these questions, we're able to estimate the socio-economic class of respondents. So we've got a kind of, if you like, a 2-track approach to kind of to get to that. We've got the income data and we've got the socio-economic estimates that we produced. Okay, enough about the methodology. And let's go into what the survey tells us. So I'm going to start off with tuition fees, and there's always, I suppose, an interest in what the kind of level of tuition fees are in India. And just to interpret this chart a little bit, the data are presented in rupees, but it's kind of easy to convert rupees to pounds because there's about 100 rupees in the pound. So that first bar there on the left, almost 8% of students in India pay annual tuition fees of £50 or less. And if you look at the next bar up, about 16% of students pay fees of between £50 and £200 per year. So you can see that tuition fees they're low by international standards, certainly low by UK standards. And we can see that only 2% of students are paying fees above £2,000. So that's kind of, if you like, that's the playing pitch as regards the tuition fees. And this chart represents the situation right across India. Now, what's kind of more interesting is if you look at how the tuition fees play out as per the different institution categories I spoke about. And an interesting finding of the survey is that actually each of the 3 institution types have the same median level of tuition fees. So if you look at the 50% along the bottom there and look up from that, the 3 different categories of institutions fall within that orange bar, if you like. So that's between £800 and £1,000 per year. Now, it's kind of surprising because I guess you would have assumed that the private for-profit sector, that the fees would be higher in those institutions. Now, there are a subset of those institutions that charge high fees, and if you look at the upper end of the bottom bar, that grey part, you'll see that there is a reasonably high proportion of institutions charging above £2,000. But generally, I think that lack of variability across the different institution types was quite interesting. We did see a little bit more variability in tuition fees at a regional level. The big thing that stands out is the Northeast. The relatively poor Northeast region has considerably lower tuition fees than average. But other than that, there wasn't huge variation, slightly higher in the West and East, but again, not huge variability across the regions in terms of tuition fees. Now we're looking at household income next, and what we can see here is that if you look at the first bar on the left first, about 8% of students in India come from households that are earning less than £150 per month. And indeed, the plurality of respondents selected the next band of somewhere between £150 and £450 a month is the household income of these students. So I think it does tell us, indeed, as Barbara mentioned earlier on, that access to higher education is occurring at a relatively low level of household income, and I think that's supported by the low tuition fee options. I mean, you can study at one of the open universities in India, as we know, for £50 to £80 per year, and about 10 or 11% of students are enrolled in distance learning courses. So there's clearly these low tuition fee options that are providing access to low income households. I think what's interesting when we look at this at a regional level, again, we didn't see huge variation. Again, apart from the northeast region, we've seen a relative consistency across. So I would have expected to see higher household incomes, for example, from the relatively wealthier south and west of India, but we didn't see that from the data. Perhaps students enrolled in higher education are from a subset of the broader population that just exhibits more economic consistency, or perhaps our use of socio-economic quotas somehow affected the results in this way. But we didn't see the kind of distribution that we might have expected, and the variations in household income that we might have expected. Now, something else that comes out from the study, and this is kind of interesting, again looking at household income, is that students enrolled in the private for-profit institutions tend to come from relatively lower household incomes, lower income households. And again, I'm not sure if that's necessarily what we would have expected. It does seem that the private for-profit sector is addressing a relatively more rural, a relatively lower income demographic. That's not to say that there aren't private providers addressing, charging relatively high fees and addressing a different demographic, but on average, across the full sector, students in the private for-profit institutions are coming from relatively lower income households, which was interesting to see. We can look at this from a kind of slightly different way. If we look at the socio-economic estimation I spoke about earlier on, you can see the blue part of the bar are students that we estimate to come from the higher socio-economic class, and students at the public institutions, there's a larger expansive blue there, if you like. So we can see that, again, from the data, it tells us that public institutions, the universities and colleges, appear to be addressing a slightly more affluent, higher socio-economic class of student in India. We also, of course, looked at the subject areas that students are studying. Some interesting findings here as well. I think probably not that surprising that engineering and technology is the most popular subject area. I should say this combines both undergraduate and postgraduate students, so it's a little bit difficult to compare it with the All India survey data. But yeah, engineering and technology, the most popular subject area. As we know, in India, that's quite a broad subject area. It includes computer engineering, it includes agricultural engineering, so it is quite a broad area. And then followed by education and business and administration. I think what's interesting is if we look at the Indian students in the UK, the international students that have gone to study in the UK, we know that business and admin is by far the largest subject area for those students, and followed by engineering and then social studies. So a slightly different breakdown in terms of which subjects are the most popular there for students in India versus students going to the UK. A couple of other interesting things we could pick out from the data. We can see that students, for example, that study creative arts and design programs tend to come from relatively higher income households, or that social studies students tend to rely more on household savings to fund their studies. So we've got some of these interesting things that we discuss in the report as well. I should say one interesting finding as well was that second category there, education, seems to be particularly popular among the mid-tier socioeconomic class. So students in that B category, about 25% of them are studying education programs. So some interesting kind of ways to slice and dice the subject level data there. Another interesting thing we found from the survey is this propensity to travel outside of the home state to study higher education. So about 1 in 5 students in India are traveling outside of their state, their home state, to study higher education. And I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, it's probably not that much. We see this phenomenon in the US, we see it in Canada, to a less extent in China because there's a quota system in place there. But interesting to see this. I think what's probably more interesting is that in 6 states, over half of the students, based on our survey data, travelled outside of their home state to access higher education. And 3 of these states were in the north of India. And it's a different story than in the south of India, where there was a far lower propensity to travel outside of the home state for higher education study purposes. So this kind of a divergence or a difference between the north and south of India, where the north is a net, the loser is losing students, and the south is not losing students, and in some cases is attracting students in. I should say in the north, the big exception, of course, is Delhi, which is classified as both a city and a state, and which does attract a lot of students. But in general, the north of India seems to, based on our survey data, is losing students. And that throws up some interesting questions as to whether there's a need to provide different types of programs, maybe a different quality of provision in the north is demanded. You know, these kinds of interesting questions arise from the study naturally. For me, one of the most interesting topics to look at in the survey was the whole area of funding for higher education. So this chart presents the data across all India, and I think what you can see here clearly is that support from family is by far the most important source of funding for higher education study, followed by loans from an official financial institution. That's bank loans, really, and over to the right there, to the extreme right of the chart, loans from unofficial lenders. It's good to have that information, but what's interesting about this is that it plays out quite differently in different regions of India. So support from family is even more prominent in the relatively poor northeast part of India. Over 80% of students there said that they rely heavily on support from family. Bank loans, far more prominent in the south of India and centre of India, less prominent in the east and northeast of India, which is interesting to observe those differences. Scholarships, for example, being more common and a more important source of funding in the north of India than they are in the south. And things we can see in the data, like students from relatively low-income households tending to rely on loans from unofficial or private lenders, and the opposite to that is actually students that access bank loans tend to come from slightly higher income families, and interestingly tend to be more likely to be enrolled in a public institution. So I think these dynamics playing out differently, these funding dynamics playing out differently in India is interesting, and especially those kind of funding gaps, which I think we can see exist in the east and northeast of India. I think addressing those gaps will be a priority for policymakers going forward. Seem to be stuck on this. Okay, that's good. Now, coming near the end of it, but we also asked about whether cost was a factor in choosing the higher education institution. And what's interesting for me is that, you know, the large proportion of students that were either neutral about this or that said that it wasn't a factor, about a quarter of respondents said it wasn't a factor. I think this speaks more to, again, the low tuition fees options that are available, rather than being some kind of inelastic response to pricing. If we dig into the data, we did see that students that attend the private for-profit institutions and students in the northeast, cost was more of an issue. So interesting to see that. We asked the exact same question as regards whether cost was a factor in choosing this specific higher education program, and we got a very similar response to the one I've just presented there on institutions. Now, the survey was primarily about studying in in India, and we really want to understand what's happening domestically in India. And we always, from the outset, this was a domestic study. We did include one question on whether students had an aspiration or an interest to study abroad, and it was just that. We left it kind of, aspirational, let's say. And we found that about 55% of students had, in some way, considered to study abroad, but couldn't because of the cost. And looking forward, a similar proportion, have some desire at some point in time to study abroad. So, definitely we picked up on a strong underlying demand to study abroad that could, progressively materialize as household incomes rise in India. We did see that that undergraduate students in the West and postgraduate students in the North showed the strongest interest in study abroad, and also that students in the Northeast had the least interest in study abroad. So we picked up on some of those nuances and have set them out in the report as well. So there's kind of a lot of data there. There's a lot of good stuff we found out. I think it's thrown up quite a few surprises as well. Just to conclude, I think the lack in variability of household incomes was a big surprise for me, and it kind of causes me to question whether we maybe didn't, maybe we shouldn't have used the socio-economic quotas the way we did. Or I would certainly like to revisit that whole issue at another point if possible, but maybe that's exactly the way it is. The slightly more variability with tuition fees, but again, perhaps not as much as I would have expected. So there were some surprises in the findings, definitely. I think a really significant finding, and Barbara referenced this, was the fact that the private for-profit sector is in the main actually addressing a relatively poorer and lower income demographic in India. That's very interesting, to see the role that private for-profit sector is playing, because it doesn't necessarily play out that way in other countries when we analyse, when we run surveys. So I think I would say that, no doubt the demand for higher education in India will continue to grow very strongly over the coming over the years ahead, over the coming decade. The tertiary enrollment rate is still 27-28%. There's lots of room for it to grow. I think the big question is how that will be facilitated and what role these private providers will play, because I think as household incomes rise, these private providers, and including foreign providers, will not just be addressing the access agenda, but they'll also be addressing the quality agenda, because you're going to see more and more demand for higher quality programs as India develops as an economy and as household incomes rise. I also think that it's very exciting, of course, the National Education Policy published in India last year, the signalling of an opening up to foreign universities. But I think, in some senses, to square that with the low tuition fee environment that we see, considering that T&E can be quite costly to deliver, there's questions about how that will work in practice going forward. So I think that's a brief tour through the main report findings. For people that are interested in a copy of the report, the PowerPoint deck, I've included some appendices slides that show the projections for household income growth in India over the coming decade. And you see they're quite significant. The middle class expected to expand pretty rapidly over the next 10 years. I've also shown some how income is distributed in India by showing the 5 wealthiest versus the 5 poorest states in India, and also just for some context, you can see how the 5 largest higher education systems in the world stack up there. You can see India is the second largest, and has, of the 5, has the lowest tertiary participation rate. So clearly, huge room for growth, continued growth in India's education system. So that's really it in terms of the report's main findings. I think there's quite a lot to chew on there and to think about. It is somewhat one-dimensional in the sense that the study was purely survey-driven. We didn't conduct interviews. We did supplement it with desk-based research where required, but it certainly, addresses an area which we feel needs to be addressed. It raises probably as many questions as it answers, and I don't think that's a bad thing. So that's it from me. Back to you, Ritika.
Yeah.
You're on mute, Ritika.
That's the statement of the century. You're on mute, but thanks a lot, John. That was really, really interesting to listen to all of that. I do want to remind all those who are listening in that do put your questions in the chat, and even if we are unable to address them immediately because we want to hear our panelists, we will try and respond to them. My colleagues will respond to you on the chat itself. So do keep asking the questions as we speak. Now we have a conversation with our three very eminent panelists who I would like to introduce to you. I'll start with Professor Verghese. Professor Verghese is the Vice Chancellor of the National Institute of Education, Planning and Administration, and he's also the founding director of the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education. He's an educational economist, and he was the head of governance and management in education, International Institute of Education Planning, IIEP of UNESCO, in Paris until October 2013. So he has a vast range of experience, both national and international, around these areas, and we will listen to him in a little while. We also have with us Professor Limbadri, Chairman, Telangana State Council of Higher Education. Professor Limbadri has been an alumni of the Osmania University, and he has he's got experience in administration as officer on special duty. He has been awarded an annual case study award in 2012 from the Indian Institute of Public Administration in New Delhi, and his inputs in these conversations will be really, really important to us, because he speaks to many, many universities in the state and has an experience from the southern part of our country as well. We have with us Dr. Nitin Karmalkar, Vice Chancellor of the Savitribai Phule Pune University. He's a well-known scientist. He's a geologist with 30 research publications, and he's worked with various research collaborators in Australia, France, and Germany. He's also a council member of the Geological Society of India and the fellow of the Maharashtra Academy of Sciences, chairman of the Birbal Sahni Institute of Paleo Sciences, and a member of the governing body and the governing council of CEC, and member of the steering committee on city resilience strategy. Professor Karmalkar is the recipient of the C. Nagana Gold Medal of the Mineralogy Society of India towards his contribution in the field of alkaline magnetism. So many of the words in his CV are difficult for me to understand, but it seems that he's been contributing a lot in the area of his specialization. So I'll begin by going to Professor Verghese first, and then to all of you to tell us, are there any aspects of the report that surprised you, or was it something that reinforced what you knew? You know, was there anything that was a surprise, Professor Verghese?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I think it is a great opportunity to learn about the new survey that has been carried out. First and foremost, I should congratulate the British Council for carrying out this study, because what is also important to understand is that in India and globally, we have several studies on financing of education, looking at from the provider point of view or from the supply point of view. We have very few studies from the demand side and from the people who are actually paying or not paying, that is not there. So from that point of view, I feel that the study gives some insights into some of the dimensions, and that is very important and new. 2,700 students, the sample is reasonably good sample, and it's not an easy task. And you managed to collect information from the 2,700 students. That is very good. And also, if you see the sample size of the overweight of undergraduate is a reality in Indian education, although the percentages that you show for postgraduate and research, etc., may be varying. But if you're not going by the cardinal measurement, and if you're going by the ordinal measurement, I think your sample justifies the type of distribution of students by levels of education in India. That is also a very positive thing. I think one of the questions that you asked me is that, is there any surprises? So let me come to the surprising thing. The surprise for me is that what we let me first start by saying that the study shows that only 8% of the students in the sample are coming from the lowest income group in the scale that you put. That means 15,000. And others are coming from the higher income groups. I would like to say that the 45,000 that you are taking here is at least 4 times the per capita income of India. So categorizing them as a low socio-economic background needs a careful analysis, because it will not go. Perhaps there is a confusion between converting this into pounds. When you are converting the pounds, these are peanuts. But when you are looking into the Indian side, these are huge amount. So the first point that I try to say is that if you look into 2007 National Sample Survey or NSS survey or 2014 sample survey, etc., one point that is increasingly shown or very clearly indicated is that so far as enrollment in higher education is concerned, very less number of students and a small share of students come from the poor background. That is justified by the number of students coming from the less than 15,000, which is only 8%. That is true. But the other is a big jump that needs little qualification. Maybe when you try to look into this once again, you will be able to provide that, a second dimension, which is also, so therefore that part, the first part is not a surprise, 8%. But the next part is a big surprise to me, because what I need to superimpose is a piece of information that 78% of the institutions and 66% of the students in higher education in India are in the private sector. So therefore, when we talk about the cost of education, which sector the students are coming is very important. So what is surprising to me is that 59% of the students are in the public institutions, and these 59% of the students are paying higher fees, and perhaps that is something which is surprising. I think I will certainly say that there is a need. I'm not saying that your survey is wrong or anything. Please do not misunderstand me. But I think that needs a little more careful analysis, because it's a sensitive issue that we are talking about. That if you say that public institutions are more expensive than the private institutions, it is certainly a sensitive issue that needs a careful analysis. Now let me say that if what is little more adding to that debate or difficulty is that the southern states you find larger number of private institutions, and there is a concentration of private institutions, whether you are taking Andhra Pradesh or Telangana or Tamil Nadu or Kerala, not to that extent, even then it is quite high, or you take Karnataka. So one expects that the per student expenditure from the household point of view, from the people who are demanding it, should have been much higher in that region than in the northeast or northern side, where people are still depending upon the public institutions. So for example, in Bihar, the total number of, there are only 12 institutions per 1 lakh population or 100,000 population, whereas you find that the same is around 55 or 60 in some of the southern states. In Bengal, it is only 15 or 16. So you find that there is a wide variation in the distribution of public institutions, because there are states where you find that the cost is very high, are also the places where public institutions are dominating. And in these public institutions are not levying fees. So therefore, for me, as a planner from the macro level, I find that this particular finding a little more difficult to accept in its face value. So I hope I am not disappointing you when I'm making this point, but this is something when I little more analytically look into little more details, I find that that is slightly problematic. If you are talking about the institutions which are like IITs and IIMs, etc., then the story is different. But I do not think that. One of the reasons what I feel is that engineering may be giving scope for more number of students from the IITs and engineering, IITs and IIMs, etc. Then there is no problem. I find no issue there. But on the other hand, what I find is that education, the share of students from education is very high. And nobody is ready to pay high fees for getting a degree in education. I'm sure that our vice chancellors will agree with me. People do not pay very high fees. On the other hand, Dr. Lambadri will say that, many students from neighboring states also come to Andhra Pradesh for engineering studies, and especially when the capitation fee colleges are there. Okay, so that is something that one needs to do that. Let me make 2 more points. Can I take 2 more minutes?
Yes, please.
So let me say that, perhaps there is a problem with using the word tuition fees. What I mean to say is that there used to be a system whereby the students, front loading of the fees, and they pay in Indian terms, since I hope all of you understand Indian lakhs, 100,000 Indian rupees, So in some of the institutions they take previously in the 1890s, etc. It used to be called as a capitation fee. They take 10 lakhs, 15 lakhs, etc. Or some places it used to be medical colleges, it used to be 25 lakhs, and dental colleges it used to be around 20 lakhs, etc. That is a fee that they take. Then what happens is that the tuition fee that is levied is low. It is not very high. So which means that what is being suggested as the fee that is levied is not actually the payment that is made. So there is a difference between the tuition fees and the cost of education that is provided, So there is a need to see that if the already collected data indicates something, any other, suppose they have given any other expenditure, and what is the nature of that any other expenditure, etc. That is something to be seen. Another point also equally important is that when we say that cost is not a part of decision making to go to the college, that is slightly worrying. On the one hand, we say that the cost is high, and public institutions also the cost is high. Then we say that the cost is not an important factor. Why? Because the choice of institution in India, cost is a factor. Dr. Lambadri is here, so I should not preempt from speaking. So in his state, what happened was that engineering education, many of the engineering colleges are in the verge of getting closed down. Less number of enrollment because students were not ready to pay high amount of fees in the engineering colleges because the employment rate declined as a result of the unemployment. So his government introduced, he's not responsible for that. His government introduced in 2008-9 what is called as a fee reimbursement scheme. Indirectly, this was helping the private institutions to survive, not to make profits, to survive, because otherwise some of the institutions would have been closed down in that process. So there was a public financing of private institutions that has happened. It's a new change that has happened. In your study also, if you look at this, 90% of the loans that are taken are from the public sector banks and government, not government banks, public sector banks. And you should understand that this loan is almost interest free or very low interest that you have already mentioned in this. So what does it mean? The 90% of the loans are this, and you find that a major share of the financing is funded by the household. But in India today, the student loans, the amount of money that is spent on student loans is more than the amount of budgetary allocation for higher education from the central government. So this has gone like anything, increased like anything as a result of the growth of the private sector. Or in other words, there are two ways in which financing takes place in India. The public financing of private institutions. Let me repeat what I'm saying. There is a trend that is taking place that your institutions are private. The government cannot give money directly to the private institution. That will be scandalous, and therefore money is channeled through the students. There are two routes in which this money is channeled. One is through the students, through the student loans. Other is through the student fee reimbursement schemes, etc., which I talked about it. Now, 90% of the loans you find that are financing are financed from the public sector. Say, for example, we have a bank called State Bank of India, which is the single largest entity providing loans to the students in the country. And if you see their growth in the student loans, it is a very large exponential growth that you find over a period of time. So therefore, this change that is taking place in financing, in the financing arrangement through the student loan, although in your sample it is much less share of students that are shown through this, So essentially, what does the study show in terms of changes? I think since the households are funding, see if I look back to little sociology and leave economics, what I get from the study is that which is the privileged group who are coming to education, what is the poor group which is coming, or middle group which is coming, etc. One gets the feeling that the demand for education, especially with the growth of the private sector and private higher educational institutions, is protecting the privileged groups, defined more in terms of finances rather than in terms of the aristocracy and the social prestige, etc. were attached to the household. So the change that is taking place, I'm reading into your result, not what you have said. I am inferring from your result in the context of the change that we are talking about in the Indian situation, and it is that this change is a new evolution that has happened from 1991 in India after liberalization, a new change that is taking place, emergence of a new middle class, Madam, I am stopping. So
thank you so much, Professor Verghese. That was really insightful. And because you referred to Professor Limbadri so many times in your conversation, we go to Professor Limbadri next. Sir, what indeed did surprise you, or what was your comment on the report that you just heard, the presentation by John? You're on mute, sir.
You have to unmute.
Thank you, Ritika Chandagaru, and the Professor Verghese has covered so many aspects of fees, tuition fees, and other aspects are concerned. As the survey found that the consistent across the tuition fees in type of public and private institutions and profit, non-profit organizations also. Really, the consistency in the tuition fees is required for the institutional survival to provide a quality education into the institutions are concerned. But Professor Verghese rightly said that the tuition fees is not the similar to all the institutions in the country. As you said, the IITs, IIMs, and like other private institutions, one side, the other side is a regular conventional degree courses like a BA, BCom, BSc, or state-run institutions. It is a huge difference in the fee structure is concerned. For me, in Telangana, take as a case study, we have more than 1,000 degree colleges. And the degree college undergraduate fees may not be more than 20,000 per annum in different courses. It's the higher side, I am saying. Even for BA, it may be less than that. That was the situation we can find in the difference of fee structures. In the public institutions, definitely it may be there in IIT and IIMs, and private institutions may be higher than that. So this is the one thing we can see, and it continues, and all the institutions planning to enhance the tuition fees of their institutions where they can have the demand. But at the grassroots level, the government or even private degree college also unable to enhance the fees. That is the one thing we can see. The second important thing I would like to mention here is Verghese also covered. The private institutions also getting tuition fees through fees reimbursements. The 90% or 80% students in higher education getting fees reimbursement, including engineering colleges. All marginal sections and EWS, whatever the category it may be, majority students are able to get that fees reimbursement of tuition fees concerned. that also can give. But in spite of that, the enrollment is concerned. As Varghese said, the enrollment is a very interesting observation of mine is that the girls enrollment is increasing in Telangana. You take a Usmania University as a example. Nearly 65% are girls in university campus, and you look into the other social background, the 85% are the SC, ST minority students, BC students are entering into the institutions, and first in the family is coming to the institutions. This is the another aspects of the understanding the institutional dynamics in the university system. That is the one way of the present higher education in the public institutions. Even private institutions also, the government is providing the fees reimbursement scheme for the all the categories who have the income bracket in that eligibility criteria is concerned. This is the with regard to the tuition fees of the higher education institutions are concerned, and definitely your study has given a wonderful inputs to understand the correlation with the financial resources on higher education to have. To that, the Telangana not only giving the fees reimbursement and financial support to the students, in other way, they are trying to improve the financial resources of the households in providing the different other economical aspects like a agricultural development programs like a Raitu Bandhu, or providing a free water, free electricity for the peasants, agriculturists to improve the income. That has given a good result in Telangana, that the income level of the individuals has increased for last 2-3 years when they get this type of support from the government side. In turn, we can understand the enrollment in the institutions has been increasing because they have the some financial support to invest on the education is concerned. That type of things are taking place in Telangana is concerned. Definitely the financial resources have the connection with the enrollment of higher education is, and the tuition fees. We are not only to discuss about the tuition fees. Tuition fees definitely maybe looks in a bit minimum number, but another expenditure like a living expenditure is also one of the important component in the higher education is concerned. The living component, the hostels and other expenditures, and even in the pandemic situation, people need some electricity and internet connectivity. These are all comes to persuasion of higher education is concerned. So that is also needs a support to get the quality education is concerned. So that is also keep in mind to not only to confine to the tuition fees is concerned. This is my observations in this case.
You're on mute. Ritika, you're on mute.
So I think we have here, Professor Limbadri, thank you so much for your input. You've actually answered a question before it was asked. So we have in the chat a question from Professor P.V. Sharma, Founder Vice Chancellor of DTU and RGTU, who wanted a little more input on philanthropic inputs and government support other than that was covered, and your input on reimbursement of tuition fee is a very interesting angle in that respect, which would have responded to his comments over there. But to go to Professor Karmalkar, again, another one from that is, because we're British Council, we're and there's a question on student support for higher education. We had the question that 55% of students, never mind their economic capability, have considered, and wanted to study in the UK. I'm sure that this is an aspiration for a lot of people. So what would be your advice to UK and Indian universities who might want to collaborate together? How could they make it possible for making it economically possible for them to experience that? And is there any, models or something that we could look at from your perspective?
Thank you, Ritika. Indeed, a pleasure to be with you all for this wonderful discussion that is happening on the report that is based on the study British Council has undertaken. And I'm very much in Pune, and then during the pandemic, in fact, because of the online thing, we could think of getting collaborated with many outsiders. Physically, in fact, we started a program called BSc Blended with the Melbourne University. It's a blended program that has been happening. But during the pandemic, in fact, we could actually enlarge our horizon, and we started reaching more to the foreign institutions, many of the top one perhaps, so as to provide the best of the education with perhaps a lower cost. But that is what I'm speaking about, an online thing, not the physical mobility as such. And in that, we have a couple of partners, right from basically few from the British Council, or rather from England, a few of them are from United States of America, or quite many of them coming from basically Europe. So, but those are basically more or less a well sort of a years kind of a programs like the edX or the Coursera, or the courses that are offered by the Harvard Business School, MIT. All those programs basically looking at the large number of students that we're addressing were made available with a lower cost. Individually, if one has to go for these programs, avoiding the University of Pune, individually, if one has to appear, it would cost them not less than about 2.5–3 lakhs for one program. But basically, because of branding the University of Pune has, and secondly, obviously, the large number of students that get enrolled for the graduation, roughly to the tune of what, more than 500,000. Because I was surprised, in fact, to understand from the State Secretary of Telangana, there are 1,000 colleges he's speaking of. My university alone has affiliation of 1,000 colleges, and we have a jurisdiction over 3 district places: Nashik, Nagar, and Pune. So 7.5 lakh students every year getting enrolled, and for them it has become a very good opportunity, especially getting access to the online courses of many of these best, I would say, world recognized institutions or universities as such. That is one way of looking at it. The second could be the blended mode that I'm doing it with the Melbourne. So which is cheaper. In fact, the fee structure is such that like it's not on a very high side, but it is definitely not on very lower side. A typical middle class family can afford that kind of a fee structure, roughly to the tune of about say 50,000 rupees a year. And that is to a great extent is a tolerable kind of a fee structure, wherein the input that I get from the Melbourne is basically their faculty physically comes once in a while, maybe for a stay of a month, where the physical teaching happens, and then the rest all to a great extent is been done by the Indian faculty. So this kind of a basically hand-holding perhaps would provide access for a better education, and also basically would enhance the collaborations that are required as such. So this is one thing that already I'm practicing on the campus. And making use of the same model now, we actually are doing some other programs with the other university, maybe the Dexter University from the United States, wherein we are doing a master's program. The California University, with whom we are doing a liberal arts program. So perhaps this is the way. And then the new education policy obviously provides the opportunity maybe to go for a twine or a dual degree also. Then other important thing being basically the graduation from 3 years to 4 years, the degree program from 3 years to 4 years. That perhaps is a win-win situation for both, for the Indians, especially those students who intend to go abroad for their post-graduation. Otherwise, they have to go there and stay for one extra year. That adds to a more cost sort of. So instead doing 4 years here and then doing a year after there, so that basically provides rather minimize their expenditure. That is one thing. And secondly, obviously, he gets an opportunity to actually make physically to make it onto the campus, wherein obviously there's a better infrastructure, there are better facilities available. So this is how I'm thinking that perhaps the COVID and especially the new education policy to a great extent has provided these various different options, wherein we can in fact increase the number of foreign institutions on the land of this particular country in different states, maybe in a blended fashion, if you could continue with this kind of education system.
Thank you so much, Professor Karmakar. That really gives us an insight into the ways in which we could make this aspiration realizable by a lot of our young people who have responded to the survey and would have liked it. I'm just going to hop over to Professor Verghese once again to say that just ask if any other policies you feel might actually make it easier for giving students that access and making it more accessible, and international exposure more accessible to students from your perspective, besides the ones mentioned by Professor Karmakar. Sir, sir, you're on mute. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, now. Yes,
there are two trends that you find, and bank loans play a very, very important role today, even for the studies abroad. Say, for example, UK has 1 year master's degree, which is affordable through the bank loans and topping up bank loans with the household income. When it was 2 years, this was not possible. Now there are many PG diploma programs offered in Australia and in UK universities, which students can take loans, and many students do take loans and go abroad for studies. So the bank loans becomes a reliable source than the household. And who are the people coming from this? These are not the richest group of people, but not the poor people. Because when you have to take a bank loan, you have to give something as support, although it is low interest or interest free. You have to give some security against that. This can be done only by the families which are middle income families, So the middle income families are getting benefited that. But what is not clearly understood in India is that, which is touched upon by the report, John, thank you for that, this interstate mobility that you are talking about. My only criticism is that the interstate mobility that you're talking about from the north and northeast to the south is less in your sample. Because the capitation fee colleges 1980s and 1990s were established in the south, but the students were, a good number of students were from the north, because they did not have, this acted as a safety valve, because you do not get admission because your score levels are very low. You are reasonably rich family, and there is no institutional arrangement in the north in terms of capitation fee. So you go to Andhra Pradesh, undivided Andhra Pradesh. At that time, the first attraction, if you want to do engineering, you go to Andhra Pradesh, and if you want to do medical, you go to Maharashtra or Karnataka. This used to be the unwritten rule and the way in which the capitation fee manages. Why I'm making this point is that Say for example, take two subject areas. One is engineering, other is nursing. You find that the student loans are increasingly used by the students in the nursing degrees to come and study in another state. And once they finish the study, they go to Gulf countries. Previously, there used to be what is called ANC, Auxiliary Nursing Certificate. That is nobody wants that because that is not acceptable abroad. So what they need is that a graduate degree in nursing. So that is 3 years, which is more expensive for the poor households. You should understand that the medical doctors come from a better socio-economic background and the nurses come from a lower socio-economic background. The background from where the nurses are coming, this is a 3 year is a very long period and highly expensive. So they rely on this bank loans and then they go and study and get a degree. Then they migrate to Gulf countries. And to understand this further, what you find is that the biggest defaulters of student loans in India are the engineers and the nurses for two different reasons. There are studies conducted about it. There are two reasons. One is that engineers do not get employment. As I mentioned, that is why the enrollment also declined. So they cannot prepay. The nurses normally they disappear to the foreign countries and they are not in a position to repay that. Why it is important is that most of these nurses, once they go abroad, their students or their sisters, their brothers go to UK or USA for studies because they earn, So that is the route, the new route that you find now. And most of the nurses initially go to the Gulf countries and they get experience there and then they go to Australia, Canada, UK it is less now, or USA. So their income levels will be going up and that income is used to finance their sisters, brothers or children to study abroad. So that is the route of financial flow that is taking place in India in terms of Ritika, in terms of the internationalization and financial support that is emerging from this type of pattern. All this happens because of the private sector and bank loans, So that becomes the reliable source nowadays for organizing this, That's what I would like to say.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we are finishing off with time. It was such an interesting experience listening to all of you all over here. Thank you so much. It's so interesting to learn about how the ecosystem works, how the interdependencies work, and as you were describing the interstate mobility, I was remembering that railways actually ran special trains for students from West Bengal to Bangalore. Mobility, such was the mobility that there was need to arrange transportation from one state to the other. So, these were the lived experiences of all of us who've been engaged with the system. So thank you very much for your contribution today, and thanks to John for writing out this report for us and for getting us all the insights. And really it was great having somebody from outside looking into India in that sense, and we hope that we'll be able to have an interesting conversation in our next dialogue. And thank you so much for your contribution once again. With that, I would hand over to Sandeepa in case there is any announcement for the next ones.
Thank you, Ritika, and thanks once again to all our panel eminent guests. It's really been a great conversation today. Thank you for that. In terms of the questions which have been coming, we've tried to answer alongside, and we would be sharing, as I said right at the beginning, also recording presentation, and we've already provided the link to the report with everyone. Our next round of discussions, which are planned, are available on our International Education Services website. And in any case, active promotion emailers will be going around so that, we can directly reach into your inbox and you'll know which session, what topic and which day are they planned. But the next one is going to be later in November. So we'll see you then. And thank you so much. Have a nice weekend, and also in advance, happy Diwali to you all. Thank you.
Happy Diwali. Bye.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
John, special thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Vargas. Some great feedback. Thank you.
Thank you.